It's my real pleasure to introduce Karim Khan, who's going to be our first presenter today. He's going to talk about the IOC Consensus statement on load in sport and risk of injury. It's a very hot topic at the moment, and I'm personally very much looking forward to listening to you, Karim.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Can I get a show of hands, please? If you can please put your hand up if you're a physiotherapist. Thank you. Thank you. And keep your hand up if you're working in a clinical practice. You're seeing patients in the office in a clinical practice. So, as opposed to being academic in the university and not seeing patients. Yeah. So hands up, nice and high, if you see patients in the office and bill for that sort of thing. Okay, thank you. And then, thanks, Carl. It's good. And what about if you work with a team and you're seeing patients in a team setting? Okay. And so then there's quite a few in the university. Show of hands, please. Who's mainly in the university teaching? Okay, that's great. That helps all of the speakers get set that we're trying to be practical and help clinicians. And this program was designed to try and bring you up to speed across some big areas like load in sport, hot areas, and like patellofemoral pain. And so my job as the BJSM editor is to try and help you, but they're not my areas of personal expertise. So my name is on this paper, but it's not the first author or the last author, and I'm not known for this work. So it's a privilege to be part of the group and to learn, but I think it is actually a good place to share this information from, because sometimes the experts confuse us because they know so much and they take a lot for granted. Whereas in this case, I'm a learner and I'd like to share what I learned from being part of this particular IOC symposium. So I want to thank all the physios who both wrote and who've supported clinical sports medicine over the it started in 1993, so it's 25 years old, this book, but this particular version, edition 5, is only brand new since January. So I appreciate the authors particularly. You see 9 authors on the cover, including physios, Ben Klassen, Jill Cook, Anne Cools, Kay Crosley. So you see that it's very much a physio book, and there are 119 authors of that book in the English version, which is the only one right now. I'm very pleased to visit Rome. It's a privilege to be in Rome. Every time you start off in a taxi and you see a building that's 1,000 years old, and then 1,500, 2,000. It's a crazy experience to be in Rome, and it's a privilege for me to join those of you from Italy and those of you from who are visiting from other countries. I know you'll be feeling the same way. So it's a great privilege to be here, and please reciprocate and come to us in Vancouver, not as old, but quite spectacular in its own way. So I could speak for half an hour, and if I did a good job, that would be a useful half hour for you. But if I direct you to resources that will give you many, many valuable tips over a period of time, that is even more useful. So can I get a show of hands? Who has a Twitter account? Not whether you use it or not, just has a Twitter account. It's a nice and high. So, you know, there aren't many converts to Twitter, and I appreciate that it's quite English language dominated. So if you're thinking about maybe joining Twitter, the benefit is that you can follow people who are trying to share useful information. And I will give some examples in my talk. And if you follow the Twitter tag, those of you following Twitter, you can follow the hashtag advanced sports rehabilitation, there's a bit of confusion about whether it's 2017 next or GISPT. I think it's on the, yeah. But you'll see that on Twitter. My point for people who people who are on Twitter know what they're doing. The people who are thinking about joining Twitter, those of us who are on Twitter will provide good photos from slides, for example, and share that information. Now, if you're here, you don't need that information, but today we can get information from the concussion meeting in Split in Croatia, where a physiotherapist, Fiona Wilson, is tweeting from that event. And so the beauty of Twitter is that by following sports physio events, you can get facts on a tweet, but the big thing is links to resources, links to papers, links to podcasts. So one of the criticisms of Twitter was that it's 140 characters. What can you do in 140 characters? But if we provide you my favourite 10 podcasts and 6 of those are free and very valuable for you, then that's a good thing. So that's the point about Twitter, and I'll show some examples. Again, on the my apologies. On the resources side, to help you with your clinical work and to keep learning even after today and tomorrow, the app, the BJSM app, provides free blog and free podcasts. It's a great channel for the podcast that I'm going to promote. So I'm not expecting many, but who has the BJSM downloaded on their phone? Put up your hand. It's just Mario has, and you've got a few in the front. Okay, so here is, I bet most of you have 100 apps on your phone that you're not using. So why not add another one, but put it to the front page and potentially follow the blog, which has news in sports physio. And then I get that the English language podcasts aren't as fun as Italian language podcasts, but those of you that are bilingual can obviously listen to the podcast a few times. And as I'm trying to learn French in Canada, it's a good exercise for me to learn, on French podcasts. And so these English podcasts, you can listen to them a few times and get quality physio at the same time. So there's a resource. BJSM comes out 24 times a year. It's a free product for GISPT, so you can access all the content, the print content. And I put that one up because the IOC supports 4 issues a year. The International Olympic Committee supports 4 of the 24 issues a year. And the latest concussion meeting from Rome, which Tony Schneider is going to talk about, is supported by the IOC, and I'm sure he'll mention that particular issue. Okay, so before I just jump into the practical parts of training load, leadership takes a lot of work, and we saw some of our leaders from Italy visiting, and the president of the federation. We need to acknowledge the leaders because they give up their family time and their income. Leadership's generally not paid well, and so congratulations to those people. They work with a team, and I know that Carlo has a team here, so I want to acknowledge all of you personally, which was a bit the purpose of the first bit, but congratulations to each of you for making this possible. It's great to be in a fantastic auditorium, to be part of a terrific faculty, and I'm looking forward to meeting with you individually. And you'll have to excuse me for my bad Italian, and if you could do English, that would be great, but it's my limitation, so please don't be shy. It's my limitation that I don't speak Italian except for the food items. Okay, so just a quick summary of all these member benefits for GISPT. I just want people to get away from the thought that the BJSM is a journal. I wish the J word, the journal word, wasn't in there. If it was just called BJSM Media or BJSM Platform or BJSM is fun for sports physios, because the podcasts are fantastic. The YouTube videos have been watched 6 million times. So you have these multimedia resources through BJSM. And on the podcast list, there are 270 that you can listen to very easily by Googling BJSM podcast, for example, or getting the last 30 on the app. How are we going, Mario? Do you think I've made this point? We're getting a message across? Yeah? Reinforcement's good, right? Okay. And I'm sure that if you're looking to volunteer in this space, if you want to blog for GISPT, if you want to create podcasts for GISPT, Carlo will welcome that. And that one's a good one, Phil, that's for you. So highlighting the New Zealand group and Phil Glasgow's photo on the bottom right, because he's keynote speaker in New Zealand in October. Correct. Okay. So in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to just focus on this particular question of how much is too much. And really, as clinicians, you'll know that sometimes patients come in complaining of an injury and they've done a ridiculous amount of training. Often it's in preparation for a marathon and they haven't been training at a very high level. They put this goal that's unrealistic, they don't discuss it with you, and then they come to the clinic expecting you to fix them 4 weeks before the marathon, and it's just crazy. And historically we couldn't measure load very well, and we focused on things like pronation and leg length discrepancy. You know, we did a lot of things in sports physio and sports medicine, but we sort of ignored load because it was difficult to measure. But as you know, the technology has changed and we can measure load, and now it's starting to get its respect as probably the single biggest predictor of injury other than previous injury. So that's why this is in the program, and I'm acknowledging Ben Klassen as the physio there, a PT, PhD from Norway, fantastic thinker, very, very innovative person in the field, and you'll see his name as the 5th author on that paper, top left of the second column, Ben Klassen, and I recommend his work to you. As sports physios, if you Google Ben Klassen and read anything that he's written or listen to his podcasts, you'll learn stuff, and I learn stuff every time I meet with Ben Klassen. So he is a hero, a rock star of medicine internationally, and that's his photo there, nice guy, speaks Norwegian. Okay, and we published it in that particular IOC issue last year, that's why the picture on the left is there. So in this time, that's the resources, so we've crossed off the first thing of our list, and I'm going to share 4 key concepts that we need to make 8 practical implications. So that's a photo in the IOC headquarters, and those of you that aren't concentrating too much, you might think that that was us meeting in that room, and those of you that are concentrating will recognise that's not true, but that's part of the fun. And we have a room like that. There's a bit male bias, that room there, which wasn't our room because we had a good representation of women. And we discussed the challenges of a crowded calendar. So the why question is really because obviously when players like Messi and players from Juventus in the Champions League final play 68 games a year, the question is that healthy? Is that almost a form of torture? I mean, they are making €1 million a week. Maybe that helps them get over these games, but the question of these calendars is important. And Jan Ekstrand, who's in the audience today and who you'll be speaking from tomorrow, helped to bring that to the forefront, to bring the attention of the world on that, to say it's a ridiculous number. We need to discuss it and decide what's a real number, what's an appropriate number, and what can we do to minimise the load. And so I encourage you to look forward to Jan's talk tomorrow, Jan Ekstrand, and he's been a great leader of the UEFA, what we call the Champions League study. That was his vision a long time ago, and he'll highlight that tomorrow. It's an amazing contribution. So, first key concept, we think about injuries obviously as sports clinicians in the musculoskeletal side, but it also affects illness. So players get sick, and if you get sick before a marathon, that doesn't help either. If you get sick before an important football final, that's not good. And so there's a second part that I'm not going to go into, but you can see that there was the part 1 on injury and the part 2 on illness, both very important. Now, the second concept is that we had to define load in any of these meetings, and I'm in touch with the translation person here, thank you very much. We're going to be speaking about load a lot. So the idea of whether that's just the training load, like playing soccer for half an hour, or is it more than that? And at this consensus meeting, they thought it was very important to just use the word load and not workload, because if I'm stressed because I don't have enough money to pay the mortgage, if my wife is not making meals for me the way she loves to do normally because I've upset her. Very sneaky ground here, you've got to be very careful to stick to the plan. Then I'll have this emotional stress, and so that is actually could cause injury as well. So that's part of the load. So when you're speaking about load, be specific about whether you're talking about load generally, which can definitely affect injury and illness, or whether you're just talking about training load or match load, because things like lack of sleep has been shown to be an important predictor in back pain, which all channels into the biopsychosocial model that we've been hearing about a lot more recently. I know it was invented 25 or 50 years ago. It was some landmark because we published a paper on that in the BJSM from Gwen Jull. So keep that in mind. Are we talking about specific training load, or are we talking about general load? And as clinicians, if we're fixing people, maybe we need to make sure they're getting some sleep and encourage them to get some sleep, or encourage them to fix the stress in their lives. And so, be clear which part we're talking about. And so then as far as the training load goes, these experts, and it's very practical and helpful to think about what they call external load and internal load. But this external load is not the stress. We're done with all the stress now. This is about training, but it's just a way of measuring what the person perceives and what they've actually done. So you'll be hearing from Claire Ardern today and tomorrow. She's a very athletic academic. And so if we both go for a bike ride together, then my internal load will be very high because I'll be tired and exhausted, and I'll say that this is a 10 out of 10 for me. And she will hardly raise a sweat. And for her, it'll be a 2 out of 10 on that bike ride. So her internal load is much lower, but we're actually doing the same training. But that equivalent training is captured by the concept of external load, because that's the objective measure of performance. If we rode 20 kilometres, if we rode 40 kilometres, that's the external load. So when you're reading these papers and thinking about it, think about whether you're talking about external load or internal load. And there was a technology phase in the 1990s. We thought everything was going to be just, fixed with technology. We could MRI people and we'd find medical answers. It was all about the technology. And so a lot of physiologists, as you know, and you may have worked with them, were thinking that we could measure blood lactate, we could measure saliva. There's ways of telling whether players are almost overtrained with biology. Unfortunately, that's not true. And so this is a very important paper from a year ago where Anna Saw, who finished her PhD and worked with teams, was making the point that self-reported measures, if a player tells you that the player's tired, if the player tells you that they're not happy, if the player has a smiley face icon and chooses a middle one rather than a smiley one, that is equally as good, if not better, than measuring blood levels of something. And so Tim Noakes would argue that that comes back to the central governor. It's our brain is very sophisticated, and so why would a blood test be better than what our brain is telling us when it's taking all things into account? There are questionnaires for that, and people who are more expert in the field will be able to discuss that with you if you want to say which questionnaires is best in your team potentially. And we'll get to the issue of screening your players by giving them questionnaires in the clinical part. Now, the ways of measuring external load, in a track athlete, it's very easy. A 400 metre runner might do 6 200 metre runs and 6 100 metre runs. So that's easier. But in team sports and football codes, it was difficult historically. But now with accelerometers, that can be done, GPS units. Now, they're expensive, but at the English Premier League, apparently they spend up to £750,000 on the equipment and the monitoring. So that can be a challenge. As clinicians, what can we do? Well, there's this concept of RPE in English. I'm not sure how that translates in Italian, but I'll go through that in the next slide. It's was originally called Borg because Bjorn Borg was such a good tennis player. That's mild humour for those of you who are still following me with my accent. So a Swedish scientist called Borg had this rating scale from either 0 to 10 or up to 20. And in team sports, this 10 works very well. And so the practical example is that you ask the player at the end of the session, how hard was that session? And so you see the numbers, and if they say it was a 7, then that's okay, 7. And then if they trained for 60 minutes, I'll use this example that I've got on the slide, why not? They say it was an 8, and then they trained for 30 minutes, that gives them 240 RPE minutes. It's a unit, it's 240 minutes of this unit. Now, if you're drinking wine with a friend and saying, I did 240 of these units, the units are kind of meaningless. But the good thing is, if we compare our units week in, week out, we compare them across the team, it gives us a very good metric of how we're training. So the session RPE is proved to be a very useful concept in this field. And you can do it for free, interestingly. It's powerful, it's very effective, and yet it's cheap. Just another sort of example of the, just to see which one shows up better on the slide. Interesting, extremely simple concept. So now we move on to the key concept number 4, and this is the last of these key concepts that we need before we can build on clinical implication. And we used to, as clinicians, we used to be surprised how some people could, I worked in basketball, and some players could do heavy training and not get injured, and other players would do exactly the same training and get injured. And it seemed to be a bit of a mystery, and we assumed it was genetic or something. But we were never comparing the player's previous workload to their current workload. We were just measuring workload by training sessions, okay? And so then Tim Gabbett's big contribution is really to look at it as a ratio, and once you think about it, it becomes almost obvious, but like good concepts, they're not obvious to everyone initially. So if I haven't been training very much, and then I do a certain training load, and my colleague Mario Bazzini, because he's very fit, has been doing consistent training, and we both do that same training load, clearly I'm more likely to be injured because I'm just doing it freshly. So it's the ratio concept, it's the concept of a ratio, and I'm sure that was invented in Rome. You know, it just seems like one of those things that had to be invented in Rome, a ratio. Pythagoras probably, but I'll stop there. Okay, so we're measuring the current load to the past load, and you get the acute to chronic workload ratio. The words are more complicated than the concept, very simple concept. Okay, and we'll walk through this slide to get it, because it is a key concept. So on this first slide, we're doing running distance in metres, but it could be football training. It's a concept, but it's good to have a concrete example. So this black bar is the acute workload, so that's in the current week. So we use the word acute to mean for the current week. So in this week they did 1,500 metres of high speed running, 2,000 metres, 2,000 metres, 2,500 metres. That just gives you a perspective of 4 weeks of training. And then what we do is we can average those 4 and have the first chronic workload on our graph. So you have to have 4 weeks of training to be able to come up with the first monthly average. So this is over the last 4 weeks, that's the average, okay? It's like if you're having a salary, you get paid every week, then you average the salary over 4 weeks. Not hard. And then after 1 more week, after the 5th week of training, we can draw the new average, which includes this 5th week and eliminates this first week. So it's always like a window of 4 weeks that you're looking at. That gives you the chronic workload. And then we can do this on a macro, so this is the first 5 weeks, but you can just do a whole half year. That's not an oxymoron. And just plot these things for the whole season, and you can look at these spikes, and you can see that here around week 12, the actual ratio is much higher than it was at other stages. So I slipped into the ratio phase. Forget this to start off with. Just think this one is the same as this one, but just over 26 weeks. It's like, yep, we get that. And here's the distance on the y-axis, the weekly distance. And now we're adding this ratio on this right-hand side by saying, if it's exactly the same, the average stays exactly the same, it would be 1. So on this axis, 1 would mean over the 5th week, I'm doing exactly the same as the previous 4 weeks. My ratio is staying the same. if the ratio goes up towards 2, it means my current training is heavier than my average was before, so that's risky. And so the high numbers are bad. So here, you know, they're doing twice as much in that week as they're used to doing, and we know from overtraining studies that that's not helpful, and so this would put the person at risk of injury. And because the players have data from injuries, they have data from the clubs, and the people like Tim Gabbett have data, they can actually see who got injured. And so then they can make a normogram like this, and if we'll have, this is the weekly acute, means in the recent week, and it's the percentage of their normal average. So if it's 100%, it's right on average, percentage of normal average. So if they're doing 100%, they're doing the same as last week. And if they're used to doing 100%, you get a very low, you get this average here, is 3.3. Their risk of injury for this particular person is 3.3%, which is the risk of injury in sport. So they're just doing what they usually do. They've got a background of normally doing that. So their risk of injury is 3.3. And you see that's in the nice green numbers. Now let's contrast with that for someone who is going to be at very high risk, and we see someone, we'll take this one here, where they haven't been training very much. Their chronic workload is low. They're not doing what they used to be doing, so they haven't got money training history, and they're doing more than average, and now they have a 36 times, their risk is 36 now, instead of 3.3. So that's a very high number, and that's the problem with all these spots in the red. So these numbers are percentages. So I mentioned this person had a 3.3% risk of having injury. You know, this one we talked about had a 36% of injury, risk of injury. You have 3 of those players, one of them's going to get injured. And so we can see that what makes you likely to go in the red is if you have more acute workload, so you're doing 110, 120, 20% increases on what you normally do, 10% increases on what you normally do, or you haven't been able to maintain the chronic workload. So low numbers here, and this in clinical practice are the people who are coming back from injury. Someone's had a hamstring injury, they've been doing relatively less training for a period of time, and so their chronic workload is down. It's lower than the average for the team, lower from their average, and you see once you get low down here, you get into these red numbers, even if the weekly training is low. That's the important point here. This person's only doing 60% of what they're used to doing, but because their chronic workload is 30% of what they should be doing, they're still at a 15% risk of injury. It's a simple concept, nice to have the numbers, and actually easy to apply in clinic. So, we go to some practical implications now. We'll punch through these from that foundation. I could ask a question if we had more time and say, do you think injury is directly related to load? The more load there is, the more injuries there are. And from listening to what I've already said, you go, no, it depends on their previous training, of course. So this would be the arrow. If we didn't have any background knowledge, I'd say a lot of people think that this is how injury and training goes. The more training you do this way, the more your risk of injury this way. But that's not the case, because what happens is that, and I'm going to actually go to this curve here. It's more like this particular curve where as you do more training, you can lower your risk of injury. Initially, you can have a sweet spot, a lowered risk of injury. So it's more like a U-curve than a linear relationship, because if you're under training down here, that means you've been resting a lot, and this week's training load will injure you. So these people have been missing training, they've been injured, they come back and they get injured again. So these are the chronic people in physio all the time. They go and they break down, and the Belgian player at Manchester City is a good example of that, but I'm having trouble with his name. Vincent Company, thank you very much. So he's had like 7 or 14 hamstring injuries, but it's very difficult because he never gets enough chronic training to get into this sweet spot. So that's the problem. And then clearly, eventually, you can break people down by putting them in danger zone. But the key concept is that injury risk looks like a U-curve rather than a line. And this is a photo of Tim Gabbett, whose work I commend to you in this field. Now, from what you've said, it would make sense that pre-season training gives you a healthy loading, and that's actually the case. So Johan Vint is photoed there. He's a PhD student that I'm fortunate enough to work with, and Tim Gabbett, who's the leader in the world on this work, and Jan Ekstrand is on the committee. We published this particular paper already in the BJSM. Don't know how we got it in that fast. It's amazing. It's hard to get in there normally. And we made the point that if you get a good pre-season under your belt, then if you're able to train consistently for months before the season starts, then you get less likely to be injured in the season, even if you take this workload stuff into account during the season. So the pre-season benefit is independent of the in-season work, and what this shows is that for every 10 sessions that the person could get into pre-season training, their risk of injury went down, of missing a game went down. I should know this exactly, I think it's 10%. So this is the percentage of games missed due to injury. And so these players missed half the games in the season because they only completed 15 sessions. Pre-season goes for about 15, 20 weeks. There's about 4 or 5 sessions a week. These people here only missed 10% of the season because they completed virtually all of the pre-season. So number of training sessions in pre-season is an investment to lower your risk of injury from these higher levels, let's say 30%, down to something as low as 10%. Really interesting work. And that was in rugby league. So as a physio, when we're trying to rehabilitate patients, try to get them to do other work. And the classic example is if they've got a knee injury, you still get them on exercise bike. If they've fallen and got an upper limb injury, you're getting them into biking, swimming, things like that. We know that as a principle as clinicians, but this is a good argument for why we need to do it to prevent future injuries. Okay. And when we're clinicians, we want to obviously look at what's involved in the sport and bring people back in all those components. So this is a contact sport like a football or a rugby. And so there's a running component, but there's also the impact events, the tackling, and we've got to progress those when we're rehabilitating a player as well. And there's repeat efforts where it's not just one full speed sprint, but it's a series of full speed sprints. And those numbers on that slide are from the performance of the sport. So the last one, repeat efforts. In soccer, you might need to do one every 4 minutes. When a player first comes back from a hamstring injury, you might only have them doing one in 30 minutes of training. And so you've got to do that progression. So as physios, you think about progressing exercises the whole time. In a sports physio setting, think of the domains where they need to be able to get load. So we've got to understand the sport, and just the purpose of this picture is to say that what's actually involved. You see the athlete wearing sophisticated physiology equipment to be able to measure the things that need to be measured. And in football, Jens Bangsbo has done a lot of that. And then there's the Yoyo test, and how much sprinting, how much repeating, how much backwards. We've got to really understand the sport so you can build the player back to the demands that you need. And I just put this slide in because we know that younger players can't sustain the load as well as more experienced players. So from my basketball work, it was the 12 to 18-year-olds where they got patellar tendinopathy and they weren't used to the long-term load. Obviously, their tissues might be more vulnerable, so you overlay that on the age. And then at the other end of the spectrum, in professional sports like football codes, like John Terry, people in AFL, they can play, but they can't train as hard, and so you have to work them gradually to get the chronic training in. So think about age as a clinician. And ultimately, you've got a 68-game schedule for these top football teams. and you just cannot manage each player acute chronic workload ratio and give them appropriate recovery to keep their ratios perfect sometimes without rotating the players. And that's why the rich clubs can do better than a club like Leicester City, because, and sorry to be using EPL examples, but I'm not following La Liga as much as I should be. So they've got this advantage where they can rotate players and get through their midweek games, which is very helpful, obviously. And that's why Leicester City did well the year they won the Premier League and then struggled last year, probably one of the factors. But Jan Ekstrand's more a football expert, he can talk about that tomorrow. Last of the practical implications. We've always say that prevention is better than treatment, and we love to detect injuries early, but the players aren't going to do that themselves. They're not going to come in and say, I've got a 2% injury risk. So we've got to be proactive, and I hope Phil talks about this, because you did a great job talking about this in the podcast, in your podcast as well. But this podcast from Ben Klassen is the secrets from Norway on how they prevent injuries in their Olympic program, and it applies to football coach as well. And he just gives all the secrets right there, a very detailed outline. And the key point, you just Google BJSM podcast and Ben Klassen. Google works best if you put BJSM podcast in first and then the name of the guest. Otherwise you get all their other stuff that they've done. So they ask their players 4 questions, and this is my last point. So they use an app and they just ask patients, every player in their team, 4 questions. So this is their Olympic team that's spread all around the world. So they're not relying on the player to tell them that they're injured or they're starting to have problems. They have these very simple questions. Have you had any difficulties participating in normal training? Have you had a little bit of illness? And how much has this bothered you? Because that way you detect overuse injuries. The problem with overuse injuries is they don't stop a player from playing, and they don't stop a player from going to the clinician. And so you need this, what they call an active approach with the player, and the questions are all documented in BJSM and on his app. And so if we just follow this last slide, if there's no problems reported, they're finished in 2 minutes. So the players don't mind doing this. But if the players have an injury and illness, then it gets followed up by the clinician, and the players actually like it because they feel that you're giving them attention. So this is a very, very successful program. It's working in real life. It's not just a research thing. And the principle is that you've got to be active and communicating to these players, having them do something simple. In this case, they love answering the questions on their phone, and no problem at all. So the summary was that I provided a bunch of resources that I hope you'll some of you will find useful. I appreciate that we've got some, we need to do more in the Italian language, and we'd be open to help from you with that. I gave 4 key concepts that allowed us to launch into 8 practical implications, and that's the reference. And I'm just finished by saying thank you, and I'm looking forward to being engaged over the rest of today and all of tomorrow, and please do feel free to say hello. Thank you very much.